We kick off with our news headlines. I'm delighted to say that my first guest is Joseph Kotrie-Monson. I love talking to this man because he's just got that legal eye on things happening. Joseph, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining me. As I said, I've just been singing your praises. You probably heard.
You can see me going red, Trisha.
No, the tie is red, but you are not red as well. I want to cover, usually we cover legal things. I want to cover a few things in the headlines, but then I do want to come to a really interesting news story that I thought. So let's talk about first Zac Goldsmith's resignation. I think this is an interesting one because we've got Just Stop Oil, we've got all of these protests going on. Now, initially, it looked like Zac Goldsmith had sort of disappeared or stepped down because of his tweet during the COVID inquiry and Boris Johnson, what have you, all that. He said, no, not true. And apparently his mates are saying for quite some while, since Rishi Sunak stepped into the job, he's not been happy about environmental issues. What do you make of all of this?
Well, I think whenever anybody in the type of criminal cases that I do is being asked, Trisha, about who they told or who was aware of a certain circumstance, and the people that they say were aware of their alibi or whatever else were their mates, I say, well, we may need a slightly more independent sounding witness than that, Trisha. Not assuming that you're my client, of course. I'm interested by that. Of course, you've said mates, but the truth is it's people close to him, isn't it? Doesn't really pass the evidential standard in the court of Joseph, I'm afraid. He says he's become increasingly disenchanted, doesn't he, with government's attitude to environment. And I think the particularly visceral example he gives was when the Prime Minister, and I'm reading this, chose to attend the party of a media baron rather than an international environmental forum, as if Zac Goldsmith, son of Lord Goldsmith, has never been to a media baron's shindig.
Oh, I know that was a bit like, but yeah, what he says is true. The sorts of things. There are all sorts of bills that the Tories have pushed back under Rishi Sunak, but he could have spoken up about this a little bit earlier.
Oh, Trisha, as always, the quicker lawyer than me. He kept. There was, in fact, the animals bill attempt to be the kept animals bill, which kind of was something that grabbed people's attention because it included the bans and criminal penalties for puppy smuggling, for example. Most of us would find pretty odious, except the very small percentage of us who want to do some puppy smuggling. But that did fail. That was a Labour attempt to revive the bill, and that was in the Tory manifesto. And that failed due to lack of government support. So there may be a merit in this, and also attitudes and goals regarding our responsibilities and the amount that we've said we'll spend on infrastructure and wind farms and everything else. They always end up after the big announcement, don't they? Typically being watered down, losing steam, that kind of thing. But it's wrong to say that these types of challenges are challenges that are any different for any other minister. Government departments will always be competing for the Prime Minister's love and attention and cash. And they'll never be quite happy with what they've got because they'll always want the best for the department. And cash in government, especially now, is a finite resource. But you're right. The timing is revealing. The Privileges Committee report came out. It was clear that there were certain people who had done things that could be seen to undermine that process. And while Zac Goldsmith in his latest letter says that he had accepted that he went too far or whatever, regardless, he still seems to think that it was all right for him to challenge a parliamentary process. But it wasn't a parliamentary process. It was a judicial process operating within the rules of Parliament. And there were clear attempts to affect the outcome in a way that would have deprived the British people of a sense of vindication about what we all knew had been going on with
Joseph,
parties and everything else to a sickening extent.
Yeah, that's a really important point, because it looks like not just Zac Goldsmith, but quite a number of politicians seem to have confused this whole thing with a parliamentary inquiry with a judicial one, because he wasn't the only person that said anything. So if you're having a judicial inquiry anywhere about anything, the rule is what? That those involved on a periphery stage storm?
This was a legal process, and although it wasn't being run by a judge, it wasn't the same as when you're an MP in Parliament, protected by parliamentary privilege, which means you can say anything you want and be exempt from laws on libel, slander. Instead, this was a kind of legal process which was being conducted by Parliament, that you have to respect the integrity and independence of. And we're talking about a Conservative majority in terms of the people who were deciding the outcome and findings of that group. So, you know, the idea that from within their own ranks, people are asking them, pressuring them, or just criticizing them, all apparently in either an orchestrated attempt or a thoroughly irresponsible course of conduct to influence the process. Just not good enough. And the people deserved more.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you. I couldn't agree with you more. Just looking at, I just found this headline before we came on air, and I was absolutely fascinated. It's in the Daily Mail. The headline is, "I tried to use medieval laws to get out of a speeding fine. It didn't work." It's this guy called George Thomas. Stay with me on this, just in case you at home are thinking of this defence. George Thomas, actually, he ended up being fined £1,000. He did 58 miles an hour in a 50 miles an hour zone. And he unsuccessfully attempted to use medieval rights and customs after he was prosecuted. He apparently learned about this on a Facebook group. Could put you out of work, couldn't it, Joseph? Police say when he was asked to confirm the identity of the driver of the car, he decided to send numerous documents quoting medieval laws and customs and demands for millions of pounds in an attempt to avoid his legal obligation. It didn't work. What are these what was he trying to do? Is it valid? Is it something that we can resort to? Or was his Facebook group probably not worth
Well, I think the first thing to say is that if you're getting your legal advice from Facebook, you're prepared to pay more than you would have to pay lawyers to actually do the case for you in fines after you lose your case. There's a couple of interesting aspects of this. First of all, it highlights the fact that people who are accused of crimes, low-level crimes especially, don't have access to legal aid lawyers. In the past, that wasn't the case. There are so many motoring offences going through now because of the automation of this cash-generating speed camera machine. Even now, we've got these variable limits on these so-called smart motorways, which they're not going to build any more of because they realise that it's not very smart to close lanes so cars plough into each other stationary because they don't understand what's going on at 70 miles an hour and people die. As far as this is concerned, this is an evolution, a really dangerous evolution of a principle called the free man on the land idea. It emanates from a textbook, a pseudo textbook that came out of America in about the second half of the last century. And the principle is that if you somehow don't consent to the law of Parliament, but instead affirm to yourself and those around you your unalienable rights to be a man or a woman of the land, that probably applies to women as well, but it's all nonsense, then you are exempt. The judge cannot follow, the judge can have no power of you. You can demand the judge's oath And if the judge doesn't give you his or her oath, somehow you can lay your hands on them. Please, 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 nobody do any of this stuff, because it's internet claptrap. And what you have is vulnerable people going onto the internet for advice, because that's where we go for information, don't we? Go to my website.
Roll of eyes.
But, you know, they go on there, and then irresponsible internet, I was going to say legal crackpots, but we're not going to say that. Irresponsible internet crackpots go in there and feed them this nonsense advice. And for the person giving the advice, there's no consequence when it goes wrong. Often the person who it's not worked for, they're not going to then broadcast the failure, are they? Because they're often a little bit ashamed. So as far as the people on the internet are concerned, it works every time. But it's so dangerous. And, you know, for the money this poor guy, this poor Wally, I'm afraid to say, has had to pay out in fines, you know, he could have afforded a decent local lawyer who's done these cases hundreds of times before, who would have looked at it.
It would have cost a lot less.
Probably told him to plead guilty, and if not, helped him fight it.
Yeah. But as you said, it is difficult for people to you said there is such a shortage of what? Of who exactly can't people get to see anymore?
Well, the rule, there's a couple of different rules. There is the interest of justice, and that means is there something about you that makes you vulnerable in court proceedings? For example, if you've got a disability, that means that you can't engage with them without a lawyer.
Right.
And also, is the case serious enough that you need a lawyer? That's the interest of justice. So broad rule of thumb, unless you're at least at risk of a community order or prison, then you probably won't get a lawyer. But there's also a means test. And the means test, last time I checked, £11,000 in the magistrate's court. Well, who doesn't earn £11,000 who works? Actually, that's way less than the minimum wage. So it means most
so you've got to be you've literally got to be on the streets or doing part-time work.
If you're on benefits or very low paid,
then
that's one thing.
You can get someone.
Or if it's a Crown Court and it's a much more serious offence. So that's one element. I mean, there's something so interesting. I think also with regard to lawyers and loopholes and the secrets, you know, aren't we always kind of fascinated by the idea of some special bit of knowledge that nobody knows about that enables you to do something crazy? Do you remember that urban myth about shooting a Welsh person with a longbow in Chester being still legal?
Oh, well, yes.
You know what?
I remember that doing the round.
Nobody go down to Chester, because when I went to law school in Cheshire, College of Law, big shout out there, many years ago, I would have been horrified, but also professionally critical of anyone that I saw with a longbow.
Exactly. It would have been really, really scary. Now, I'm just trying to work out which headline we do now, just really quickly to finish up. Let's do a really light one. Wave bikini. Miss England bosses ditch swimwear round for good, just weeks after touting its return. I was absolutely amazed that I didn't realise that they brought back the whole bikini thing. They wanted to reintroduce this parade for the first time since 2009. But people were up in arms, divided views amongst contestants and media debates. They said they dropped it completely. One woman said, one of this year's semi-finalists said, confident women don't feel the need to show off their bodies. But reigning Miss London, a scientist from Middlesex, said the swimwear round empowers women to be confident in their own skin. I mean, I can't believe we are still having these discussions in 2023.
Trisha, none of this empowers anybody. Should they even have beauty pageants at all? Well, listen, in a free society, if there are people who want to enter these things and watch them, I'm not going to stop them. But the existential problem is this. These competitions are fundamentally superficial. They're about grading somebody based on some random criteria that don't mean anything to anyone anyway. They're fundamentally not about what's in somebody's heart, is in somebody's character, because you can't measure that on a scale of 1 to 10. And at times, in this period, where women are and young girls are already under so much pressure to conform to certain types of ideal, the idea then that even if they mask it and make sure that every time they explain, oh, this person also has a career, or this person isn't, you know, what they're saying is every time, not just a bimbo. Well, hang on a minute. That's not empowering. That's basically acknowledging that the whole thing is based on judging human beings in a grotesque way. And you know what? Whether or not they have swimwear, I don't see what it's got to do with the price of fish, because existentially these things are not about people, they're about superficial qualities.
Oh, Joseph, I think we know where you stand on that. Thank you. Thank you. I love talking to you. You really put open the eyes and open the brain. Joseph Kotrie-Monson there with a look at today's headlines. That's an interesting question. Let me ask you, and I'll give you the number right after this break when we'll be looking at what's happening in France. But what do you think about beauty pageants? Do you agree with Joseph? Do you think they should just do away with Miss England and all these sorts of things? I understand that Miss Universe has been bought from the Trump camp by a Thai transsexual businesswoman. So what do you think about beauty pageants? Get rid, or just a bit of fun? I'll give you the number right after this break.